Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's subject was the recommendation of patron A Great Divorce, who thought I should look at the C.S. Lewis book, Out of the Silent Planet. Lewis published the book in 1938, and it's the first novel of the Space Trilogy. About the author. It's all completely by accident, but my patrons keep lining up interesting parallels. This one more so than most. Last time I did a review, it was H.P. Lovecraft, master of cosmic horror, and today it's C.S. Lewis, master of Christian allegory. Clive Staples Lewis was born in Northern Ireland back when the whole island was still a part of the British Empire, and his family had strong ties to the Anglican Church on his mother's side. However, while growing up, Lewis was a bigger fan of Norse, Greek, and Irish myths and legends. Lewis spent about a year in France during the later days of World War I, and between his experiences on the front line and the usual teenage rebellion, he became an atheist for about 15 years. However, after becoming a professor at Oxford, he met j.r.r. Tolkien and several other religious friends and co-workers, and, partly through their influence, in 1929 he returned to the Anglican Church in a pretty big way. C.S. Lewis wrote his first novel in 1933, and it basically set the tone for the rest of his fiction writing career. Its name is The Pilgrim's Regress, and it's basically a modernized version of The Pilgrim's Progress, what is arguably the first true novel ever written in English. The Pilgrim's Progress is a thin Christian allegory written by a Puritan in the 17th century. And when I say it's thinly veiled, I mean the protagonist's name is Christian, and other characters include Mr. Worldly Wise Man, Obstinate, Pliable, and Goodwill. The Pilgrim's Regress is basically the same thing, but it deals with the state of politics and religion in 1930s Europe. Lewis would write the Space Trilogy just before and during World War II, with the first book coming out in 1938 and the last one released in 1945. The allegory is toned down compared to Pilgrim's Regress, but it's still very much present and about on par with the Chronicles of Narnia, which Lewis wrote throughout the 1950s. Incidentally, the first book in the Space Trilogy was also inspired by a discussion with Tolkien, and the protagonist is vaguely based on it. Aside from these series, Lewis wrote a few other fictional books like the Screwtape Letters and Till We Have Faces, but for the most part, Lewis wrote non-fiction about Christianity and about medieval literature, which was his academic focus. He continued to work at Oxford and Cambridge until his death in 1963, which coincidentally happened on the same day as John F. Kennedy's assassination. But let's refocus on Lewis's early career. The review. The protagonist of Out of the Silent Planet is called Dr. Elwyn Ransom, although the narrator who is writing Ransom's account later admits that this is a pseudonym. Ransom is a professor of philology, the study of historic languages and literature, but as the story begins, he's on an extended holiday. On a country road, he sticks his nose into someone else's business, and as a result, he gets abducted by Dr. Weston and Mr. Devine, and taken in their spaceship to Mars, which, according to them, the natives call Malacandra. Based on what the two men say to him, Ransom assumes that he's supposed to be some sort of human sacrifice in exchange for gold, and so when they arrive on Malacandra, Ransom runs away at the first opportunity. He eventually comes across three intelligent and friendly native species, the Hross, which are good at hunting and poetry, the Sorns, who are good at critical and theoretical thinking, and the Fifitrigi, who are good at recording history and visual arts. At the end of the novel, Ransom meets the Eldil, an energy being who rules the planet with justice and compassion, and whose species rule all planets, everywhere, in the name of Mal-Eldil, an omniscient being. In fact, the whole abduction was a misunderstanding, since the Eldil had asked Weston and Devine if they could bring someone more reasonable for him to talk to. He wanted to know about how Earth was doing, since the Eldil in charge of our planet was bent and tried to take over the universe. He was eventually contained, but his influence still pushes the humans he was supposed to protect towards greed and pride, and to all the other Eldil, the Earth has become a silent planet. The Eldil of Mars eventually demands that the two greedy travelers return to Earth and never return, and although he permits Ransom to stay, he decides to go with them. Afterwards, Ransom meets up with the narrator, and they decide to publish his story under the guise of fiction. Lewis tries very hard to describe the strange environment and the unusual creatures of Malacandra, but I had some trouble picturing what it looked like in my head until about halfway through the book. It might have to do with Lewis's inexperience with fiction at the time, but the descriptions he uses are very vague, not much more than shapes and colors. I had a much easier time picturing the great race of Yith in The Shadow Out of Time, but then description is one of Lovecraft's specialties. That being said, Lewis does provide a very detailed account of how the intelligent species of Malacandra live and work with each other, and how they all manage to cover each other's weaknesses. Much like the Chronicles of Narnia, the Christian allegory of Out of the Silent Planet is hidden just well enough for you to enjoy the story on its own merits, but it's still obvious once you know what to look for. Maladil is God, the Eldil are his angels, and the bent Eldil of Earth is Satan, who has tempted humanity away from the righteous path. Malacandra, and in fact all other planets, are Edenic and harmonious, since the fall of man never took place elsewhere. And that phrase, the fall of man, that brings up another point about this book: the way it uses male as the default. Throughout the entire book, our species is only ever referred to as man, and every alien creature Ransom encounters uses the male pronoun. There is exactly one female character anywhere in the novel, and it's a worried mother Ransom encounters once in the first chapter. This sort of female exclusion isn't unusual for the time period, but it's also hard to ignore. Back to the allegory, while Divine is simply a greedy imperialist, Weston is also part of the allegory. Weston is essentially a social Darwinist who believes that the strong have a right and a duty to crush and subsume the weak, and morality is nothing in the face of evolution and the demands of progress. This was a relatively common argument at the time, particularly among conservatives and fascists, and Weston gets an opportunity to make a big speech about it at the end of the book. A speech which is completely rejected by the Eldil, who says that it is the fear of death that inspires the anger and hatred seen on Earth. Malacandran natives, and by extension Christians, are free of that fear, and they are therefore free of conflict and murder. Although I personally think the Eldil's ability to smite anyone instantly might also have something to do with it. Overall, I'd say the book is worth a read, just for the unique take on space travel and extraterrestrial life it provides, especially considering the other directions Golden Age science fiction was going at the time. You might also want to read the other two books if you like this one, but personally, I'm not hooked enough to keep reading. The analysis. Let's set God and religion aside for 1 second. Divine and Weston are not just secular foils for a religious protagonist, they are also clear examples of imperialist mentalities. The kinds of people who want to explore distant reaches of the planet, find the people living there, and then exploit them for every penny they can get. In the 1930s, the British Empire was still alive and well, and so were people like Divine and Weston. Divine is essentially a con artist who can't wait to sell knickknacks to gullible native populations in exchange for valuable resources like gold and furs. He has zero respect for how they live or why they want knickknacks in the first place, and all he sees when he gazes on an untouched wilderness is all the money he can make by tearing it down. And Weston is worse. Weston is the kind of person who thinks that because his society is exploiting others, that means it's better, in every possible sense of the word. Weston thinks he's doing the world, or in this case the universe, a favor by being powerful and imposing himself and his culture on others, because, seriously now, look at us, look at how great we are. There is only one true way to measure greatness, and no one's doing it better than us. Ransom represents a different approach to exploration. He immerses himself in foreign cultures, learns their languages, and comes to understand that, according to their own measures of success, they're actually doing pretty great. Other cultures have their own strengths, their own versions of greatness, and despite all the differences, these strengths are just as valid and respectable as our own. In fact, we can learn something from these other cultures, but only if we take the time to understand them. Now, that all being said, Out of the Silent Planet presents a very idealized, pastoral view of the simple life, with all the alien species living in harmony with one another and with their environment, and all of them obeying a wise and infallible ruler. Now, a lot of that comes from the Christian allegory of the novel, but it's worth noting that other works and other authors who romanticize the simple life don't have that excuse to fall back on, and they still create the same basic story that we see in this book. Dancing with Wolves did it, The Last Samurai did it, Avatar did it, and for that matter, the idea of the pastoral paradise lost goes all the way back to the Greek author Hesiod, and possibly even the Garden of Eden story in Genesis. It's all related to that loss of innocence that everyone experiences as they grow up, which is why the genre has such universal reach and appeal. Personally, I'd like to believe that there's a middle ground between mindless exploitation and blind idealism, but this book, at the very least, is not presenting that middle ground. As for the recurring theme of this review series, I can see two ways of presenting it for this book. First is, do not fear the unknown, for God is unknowable, and yet He loves you. I personally see that as a contradiction, since if God is ultimately unknowable, then so is the quality and quantity of His love. The other version is, do not fear the unknown, for it may be better than what you know, which means that this book presents the same reasoning as The Shadow Out of Time, but it comes to the opposite conclusion. The Space Trilogy is a complete inversion of Lovecraft's works, and I find that utterly fascinating. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.